Welcome, everybody. So, our session today is taking action to get what you want. So, what we aim with this session is to give you a better understanding of what's meant by the term advocacy by taking you through an example of an advocacy case and showing you how we work as advocates, how we approach a case, and how you can use the same approach to advocate for yourself using a number of different resources. Are you? Oh, I'm sorry. I will speak into the microphone. My apologies. So we're going to start with telling you a bit about who we are, the advocacy team at OCD Action. We're going to focus very briefly on the Equality Act to give you a frame of the cases, of the casework that we're going to talk today about, and use an example of casework to give you some information about what makes a successful advocacy case, and to talk about what we do as advocates if we get stuck, if a case doesn't seem to be progressing, and then look at how you might use the same techniques and the same approaches that we use to advocate for yourself. We'll then look at sources of support, and we'll take questions at the end. So, to introduce us, the advocacy team at OCD Action comprises 3 paid members of staff and a team of volunteers. My name's Colette, I'm the National Advocacy Manager.
Hello, I'm Rochelle, I'm the lead advocate.
And I'm Gary, I'm an advocacy caseworker at OCD Action.
So the team delivers individual advocacy, which is UK-wide via telephone and email, and we do provide some face-to-face advocacy in England, and that's dependent on resources, availability of staff and volunteers, and depends a bit on the individual case. We also provide national advocacy, and the aim of that really is to improve the situation for a broader range of people across the country, since naturally we can only work with a small number of people in terms of providing individual face-to-face advocacy. So on average we work with around 100 individuals a year. So the model we work with at OCD Action is we only work with people who are over 18, so we work with adults who have a diagnosis of OCD and BDD, and that's self-defined. We don't need a letter from anybody's GP. And it's where somebody has a specific issue that's directly related to their OCD and BDD, and who can instruct an advocate. We can only work with people who are able to help themselves, really. And we'll flesh that out a bit more later on in the workshop. We provide advocacy that tends to be short-term, and as I say, it's issue-based. It's about a particular issue that somebody is having. So giving you some sense of the types of issues that we have provided support with. So the advocacy service in its current form has been running for 4 years. We're now in our 5th year of it. And so to give you some sense of the percentages, so the majority of the support that we provide is where people are having issues accessing care and treatment. So as you can see in year 2 of the service, 65% of the cases we worked on had care and treatment issues, and it was the same last year. As you can see, the biggest increase really in cases was, or percentage of cases, was with employment. And that's really why we've decided to focus a bit more on employment this time. In the past, we focused on care and treatment, but we thought it was probably a good time to be looking at employment issues, since most people will work or will have worked for a period of time in their lifetime. Just to say that we no longer provide support around benefits because we don't, as a team, have the expertise to be able to do that. But we can signpost you to other services that do. So to just give you a bit of a framework about for understanding or, going through the advocacy case that we're going to be talking about today, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the Equality Act. So what is it? Has everybody heard of the Equality Act? Is everybody aware of it? Could I have a show of hands if you're not familiar with, never heard of the Equality Act? Okay, that's good, right. So the Equality Act is a single piece of anti-discrimination legislation. It is the single piece. It applies in England, Wales and Scotland. Northern Ireland has a Disability Discrimination Act, but is very similar in terms of disability protection. And the Equality Act, in terms of anti-discrimination areas, there are a number of what's termed protected characteristics. So these include disability, gender reassignment, marriage or civil partnership, pregnancy, maternity, race, religion, belief, sexual orientation, and age. And basically, the Equality Act provides protection from discrimination to people who meet the criteria for those particular protected characteristics. It's a piece of legislation that applies to employers and education, housing or service providers. And one of the protected characteristics is disability, and obviously that's the one that we are interested in. And the Equality Act imposes a duty on employers or education, housing, service providers to make reasonable adjustments to remove, reduce or prevent any substantial disadvantage faced by you because of your disability. So if as an individual you meet the definition of disability under the Equality Act and you're facing a substantial disadvantage because of your disability at work, then there is a duty on your employer to adjust things at work so that you can overcome that disadvantage. We're going to flesh this out if it's, when we go through the case, to give you, help you make a bit more sense of it, really. So it can mean that the person with a disability is treated more favourably than the person without a disability, and that is lawful under the Equality Act. Now, lots of people say to us, but I've got OCD, I don't have a disability, and don't feel comfortable viewing themselves in that way. Just as reassurance with a small r, and not OCD reassurance, disability under the Equality Act, it's a legal term only. It's not how you need to be identifying yourself or how you need to be viewing yourself at all, and you don't have to be on benefits in order to meet the criteria. It's where your OCD has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on your ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. So long-term means 12 months or longer, and so if you have a diagnosis of OCD, which is likely, even with medication and treatment, to be lifelong, you meet the long-term criteria. Day-to-day activities just covers things like getting up, getting dressed, going to work, having relationships, going shopping, preparing meals. So very much, as it says, day-to-day activities. And substantial really is about the length of time it might take you to do something or the way that you might have to do it. So, for example, it might be if you're preparing a meal as having to, if you're having to, say, wash every ingredient before you can put it into your cooking, and that takes you several hours. That's an example of where it would have a substantial adverse effect. So again, just giving you a very, so the kind of advocacy support that we provide where people are struggling at work or struggling to access services or are struggling, say, at university because of their OCD is looking at the possible reasonable adjustments that might be put in place in order to enable the individual to remain in work, to access a service and to remain or go to university. So just giving you a very sort of brief overview of what is a reasonable adjustment. So this might be a change to a particular rule or practice or physical feature or the provision of extra equipment or support. We've given you today the Equality Act section of the Self-Advocacy Toolkit, and that's got some clear examples of what reasonable adjustments in different settings might look like. So reasonable adjustments are not time limited. So your employer can't say, for example, well, we put reasonable adjustments in for you last week, and this is a week on, and we don't have to do it anymore. We did it last week, we don't have to do it again. Once you have your reasonable adjustments in place, if they're reviewed and they are effective, then they should remain. Reasonable adjustments should also be free. You can't be asked to pay for the cost of them. They are a legal requirement. There is a duty on your employer, service provider, housing provider, to put reasonable adjustments in place, providing you meet the criteria for disability under the Equality Act. And it could be discrimination if they don't. And as we've said, they apply in different settings, so workplace, education, accessing services. So, for example, with accessing services, it might be that you're offered, mornings might be very difficult for you because of your OCD. Perhaps you're up all night carrying out rituals, and so it's making appointments perhaps in the afternoon rather than in the morning. It might be that you struggle to open letters, but you can manage emails, so it might be about how you're communicated with by the service. So, and the aim of reasonable adjustments is to help the person with disability, as defined by the Equality Act, to overcome the barriers that they face because of that disability, the barriers that are not faced by people who don't have a disability. But what's reasonable? And the Equality Act doesn't define what reasonable is. So it will depend very much on the particular circumstances that perhaps of your employer, the size of the employer, and the particular circumstances of your OCD. And we have had some examples of, I suppose, requests that individuals wanted, changes that individuals wanted that perhaps were not reasonable. So if you've got some examples, Gary.
Yeah, I mean, with sort of reasonable adjustments, they have to refer to the workplace and to work practices. So there have been some cases where people have come to us and said, I've got all these problems with my OCD, it really disrupts my day-to-day working, and I can't really function, and I need help. And we've gone through the Equality Act and said, yeah, you know, we can help, and the Equality Act is a very strong piece of legislation. And we've said, look, you know, what we can do, we can liaise with your employer and try and sort of negotiate with them about what would keep you in work. And they've basically come up and said, well, the only reasonable adjustment I want is I want Friday off. And sort of like, well, that's not a reasonable adjustment. It might ease the pressure. But that's a very clear example where, well, what would happen on the other 4 days? So just taking a day off would not be classed as a reasonable adjustment, and an employer, you know, could say, no, we don't accept that. What we tend to find with reasonable adjustments, there need to be more than one. It's not just having a day off. But it could actually be a good reasonable adjustment. Could be, I need to work, okay, I do 9 to 5, but due to my circumstances, 10 to 4 would suit me much better. Now, an employer may say, we could probably work with that, but of course, there's a downside, you will get less money. So that would be called a reasonable adjustment. Or it could be actually changing work practices, or it could be moving the person to another department. And the reasonable adjustments are very real because obviously people who have OCD still work, and so they do affect a lot of people. But so they have to be common sense is what I'm really saying. And as long as they're common sense, then the employer under the Equality Act has a duty to consider, and if they're valid, reasonable adjustments, they have a duty to also implement them for you.
If you've agreed for a reasonable adjustment and it's all been documented, and you come to your PDR or your valuation,
Yes.
I've worked with a charity that's very bureaucratic, that all sort of
Yeah.
criteria for your job role. And are they allowed to mark you down? So if you've done everything, you know, excellent, but actually this particular job that we've agreed you won't do because you can't do because of your OCD, do they then say, are you allowed to then mark you down?
Shouldn't. I would say under the Equality Act, no, because it's about making sure that people who have OCD have the same access to work as people who don't have OCD. So, no, you can't be marked down by a sort of performance indicator. I mean, when I get to my case study in a moment, I can give you a valid example of where that came into play. And that'll give you a bit more context to answer that question. As far as I'm concerned, no. You have a reasonable adjustment for that reason.
It did affect, say, my pay increase. So because I didn't get the level that I would have, I didn't get the pay increase that I would have.
I see what you're saying, yeah, in terms of performance indicator. I think if you sort of go down to a lesser role or a lesser job, then, you know, your pay could be adjusted in terms. But if you're actually doing the same job and you're meeting the same sort of performance indicators, the adjustments is not to say that you are less than a person. They're just there to make it as best as they can to make sure that you have the same chance. So it shouldn't be seen that you're an exception.
And if that happens, because I've actually had to leave that job now because they couldn't support me, can I then get in touch with, say, somebody, you know, one of the advocates for them to then talk?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, obviously, first thing I would say there is that we have had cases where people have come to us and they've had sort of what we call reasonable adjustments and problems at work, and what's happened is that they've sort of either resigned or about to leave, and that's probably too late. The time to it, and to come to an advocacy service or get help, is very much when you feel that your reasonable adjustment has been denied. That's when you're at your strongest power. Yeah, that's the strongest argument in your case. The Equality Act is, as I said, it's a very strong piece of legislation. It doesn't mean that you can get what you want, but it's a very strong piece of legislation. But if you suddenly leave the employer, once the contract of employment's ended, it's harder. We have tried to take up cases with employers after the person's left, but it's proved far more difficult than when you're still there. So I think my answer is, if you do run into any further problems, talk to someone immediately or come to us, basically. Yeah.
So in order to be protected under the Equality Act from discrimination and to ensure that reasonable adjustments are put in place, you need to disclose your disability. And Rochelle is going to pick up here.
Right. Hello. Okay, so one of the things that people do always ask me as a lead advocate is, should I disclose my OCD to my employer? So the one thing that we must always say, first of all, is we can't tell you whether you should or shouldn't. We can't give you advice. What we do always hope to do is to give you as much information as possible so you can make informed decisions for yourself about what you want to do moving forward. So this here, it's not an exhaustive list, but these are just some of the pros and some of the cons of disclosing your OCD to your employer, should you wish to do that. So one of the biggest things, as Colette just mentioned, if you do not disclose your OCD to your employer, you are not protected under the Equality Act. So again, it's your right whether you want to do that, but then if you do not disclose that, then reasonable adjustments cannot be put in place because your employer cannot support you for a condition or a disorder that they do not know you have. So that's the first thing that we do always tell people. So to go on to the cons of disclosing, so you may feel labelled if you do disclose that to your employer. So it may be the fact that your employer didn't know that previously, but now that they do know that you have OCD, that brings implications of itself. And obviously that shouldn't happen because you are protected under the Equality Act. But as we all know, it's not an ideal world and things do happen even when they shouldn't, unfortunately. So back to the pros of disclosing OCD, it can be really, really stressful to hide it. So in a lot of instances, it may just be easier for you and easier for your OCD also to talk about it, to tell your employer, to get their help, to get their support and let them know what's going on with you. So again, another pro of disclosing is it puts you in control. It lets you tell your employer as and when you want to. If you do need reasonable adjustments put in place, if you are in control, you can decide this is what I need to happen, of course, if they are reasonable. And you can discuss that with your employer. And again, you can be supported once they know. If they realise that something's happening, or maybe, for example, things like if you need to leave work earlier, if you need to move your lunch breaks, if you need to start work later because your OCD is really affecting you and performing your rituals, then you can ask your employer about that, you can get some help and you can be supported. Again, there are other cons of disclosing, such as you may not see your OCD as a disability. And we do fully appreciate that, but we do always say, kind of in terms of the Equality Act and being supported, that's the definition that they use. So obviously you don't have to feel that you are disabled if you don't. You may feel that you're treated differently. Again, if your employer knows that you have OCD, you may feel, well, the moment that you've disclosed it to them, they start maybe, kind of making hints or comments, and again, that shouldn't happen, but we all know that that may happen. And another con of disclosing is that your long-term career goals may be affected. So a perfect example of this is perhaps maybe, I don't know if you're lined up for a promotion and your employer knows now that you have OCD, it may be the case that they might say, well, we may no longer continue you for the promotion because we may be worried that you might get ill again and your OCD might get really bad. So that's something, unfortunately, that could happen. So again, the Equality Act is there to protect you if you do decide to disclose. But we do always say, it is completely your decision.
disclosure, can it be verbal or does it have to be in writing? Is it expected to have like something from a doctor, like what legally is it?
It's really, to a degree, kind of up to you. I know National Mind suggests that you do take a letter from your doctor. Often, any kind of disclosure in the workplace will lead to an occupational health appointment, and they're probably better placed to understand OCD, BDD. But it's, you don't have to go into a great deal of detail and shouldn't be expected to go into a great deal of detail. And it's focusing very much on the workplace or your university, that kind of thing. And also what you do disclose is obviously protected by data protection legislation, so they can't tell or shouldn't be telling everybody and anybody about it.
Well, I had a bad experience, so I did disclose. I had occupational health assessment and everything, but I was sort of forced into disclosing in a way, to a series of circumstances, but I knew what it was resulting because my manager is not discreet at all, and then it's led to everyone discussing, like behind my back, discussing like.
Yeah, and that absolutely should not happen. Not at all.
Yeah, and everybody knows that, but then what it's done. It's been done. So that's really good.
Yeah, that's not very good. I mean, if someone has disclosed your sort of condition, again, because they've released that information out of the bag, but they, could be informed that that's sort of actually a breach of the Equality Act. I mean, that's what they shouldn't be doing. I think with a lot of legislation like the Equality Act is that, some employers are not as aware of it as they should be. This sometimes is one of the problems. With the Equality Act, it's one of these acts that doesn't probably really make a lot of difference to your life until you're affected by it. And over your working life, there's a fair chance, if you have a health condition, whether it's OCD or anything else, that you may run into some problems. And then this information would be very valid. So that just to say that the reason we're doing this is because obviously what we've noticed is that there's more problems occurring now in the workplace. We're being told that mental health awareness is increasing in society. We're more aware and we're more understanding as a society, but then we also experience that there still seems to be some pretty hard-nosed discrimination going on in the workplace too. That's why the Equality Act is really so important.
Things have changed so much, haven't they? Especially in mental health since 2010.
Yeah.
So the Equality Act, it needs updated, and that's why I struggled about the term disability. But it's been really helpful to hear you to speak about that, because I feel like I'm a fraud. But it's good to know that legally where that position is.
I think a way to talk about disability, if I want to reframe that, which I used, I'm going to talk about a case study, but where I used this term, what we did, we reframed the term disability. Yeah. We reframed it into ability with adjustments. And that's a much more positive term. Yeah. Ability with adjustments. Okay. So it's not that you're disabled, you have ability and you need some adjustments. That's really what we're talking about. You're the same person, you can do equally the same job alongside any other colleague. You just need a certain amount of support. And that's what the Equality Act is there for. And where our job as advocates comes in is where an employer is not adhering to that, or a person's running into difficulty, they may contact us, and then we may, if it's a valid case, try and take it up for that person. And it's very important that someone does, because obviously, as I said, it's still going on, that there is still sort of discrimination. Okay, so what I want to sort of talk about is So what do we mean by advocacy? If we look at the slide, there are three components, which is you talk, I listen, and together we act. And each of those components are absolutely essential to the advocacy process. So how it works in practice is that, there's a mic here. So how it works in practice is that you talk, this is the client. What they would have to do is to provide us with essential information and facts. So we would need to know what's happened, yeah, what's not happened, and what's gone wrong. So what we'd want to know is really as honest as possible the situation. Because the more knowledge we have, the better chance we have of representing you. Want to do that again, Claire? Yeah. Okay. So in the role of advocate, which will say be me, my job would be to listen. That's to really understand what is important for the client, what is important for you, and your preferred outcome. Absolutely essential. And the thing that brings it all together is how we act and what we do. And so what we would do is we would develop, plan and agree strategies. And a really key thing is that without action, there is no advocacy. You know, we can talk about the Equality Act all day long, but advocacy is when we take action, when we get together and we say, right, we're going to act on this point. Yeah. There's one thing I want to say is that what advocacy is not. Advocacy is not that you give us the problem, we go away and work on it, and then we come back and say, there you are. Advocacy is very much about working together, yeah, and it requires your involvement. It involves the client's involvement at every stage. And just to sort of try and put it in some real life context, you know, we're speaking about the Equality Act and we're speaking about sort of reasonable adjustments and how advocacy works. We had a case last year where a gentleman came to us and he was at work. He had been living with OCD for about 15 years and he'd run into some real problems. And because of those problems, he was facing performance issues, and he was going to be put on a capability, a capability sort of process. And the stress of that meant that he couldn't cope, and he was signed off by his GP. What happened at that point is that he did have a union rep, which was very good. And the union rep said to him, you have to disclose that you have a mental health condition, that you have OCD. And as Rochelle's just explained, under the Equality Act, we have to do that if we want to get protection. So that's what he did. But the client said to me, he said, it virtually destroyed me having to disclose my condition. And that sounds very, very bad and a low point, but actually it did get better from that point on. He went to occupational health. They told him about the Equality Act, which sort of 10 out of 10 for them. They also told him about reasonable adjustments. And so that's what happened, is that he came to us. And so what I want to do is use that case study as well, is to demonstrate how successful advocacy can work. It doesn't work in every case, but in this case it did. So.
Can I just ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
So in cases like this, like say it's like the end of probation or living, put things into place, is it okay that you then disclose at that point, or would they say you should have disclosed from the beginning?
The way that it is that unless you disclose, the employer doesn't have a duty under the Equality Act, because effectively they don't know that you have a mental health condition. but they might actually suspect that you do, and if they are aware of that, then they should actually be looking to put reasonable adjustments proactively in place now. So, as Rochelle showed on her slide, you're in this sort of trade-off position between do I or don't I? And there's no sort of, 100% answer that way or this way. But I think it probably swings in favour of disclosing, because if you disclose, you then warrant the protection of your employer. Yeah? Okay. And so that is what is absolutely key, really. Go ahead.
So in talking about disclosure, so I'm going to be looking for new employment, having left.
Yeah.
If I go to my interview and I say, hello, this is me, I've got, I do my interview and it seems to be going well, and I say, by the way, I've got severe OCD. They're likely, because they're entry-level jobs, I'm not going into, chairman positions, they're going to think, this is hard work. Am I allowed to go to the interview, for example, if it goes well, you have to do a job, and then say, by the way, I've got OCD, because which point?
I've got a question kind of related to that, because you know how when you're filling out applications and things, and there's the disability section, which this is what I'm trying to get my head around. And also, isn't it legally that if you are disabled and you meet all the criteria, then you're guaranteed an interview? So is that sort of disclosure, because they know that you have a disability, you've not told them what it is?
Isn't that just the disability, because certain charities and companies do that, but not all of them do. They will have the two, or the equivalent of the two ticks thing.
Well, that's right. You carry on. On an application form, often now they will ask if you have a disability or you consider yourself disabled. The reason for asking that question at that point is so that, if necessary, they can put reasonable adjustments in place for the interview and the application process. That's what that's there for. I think it is difficult if you don't tick that box, and then potentially, it could be difficult if then later on during the application process you disclose your OCD. But it's a difficult one to do, because if you disclose your OCD at interview and you suspect you don't get the job as a consequence of that, is that somewhere you'd want to work anyway? I mean, I know you want to work and get paid. I get that, but it's it's so important that you find an employer that is supportive, if possible.
Absolutely.
Employers have really, they're very caring, but even charities, they have a budget. So if they're employing somebody who can only potentially run at 90% and somebody who can run at 100%, because there are a couple of things that person can't do, they're going to, it's the nature of OCD, because you can't see it. It's not like just a rap. It could potentially be something that, so it all comes with budgets and money, and it's great if you're in a career and, you're a lawyer or you're doing something really successful, but if because you haven't been able to work, so you're starting right at the beginning, it's so difficult, because your employment options are very limited anyway, so it's,
it can be a negative, because workplace is so competitive anyway, and you're right that everyone, if there's one thing that they're basing it on, and it's like it would be easier to not have a person without OCD, so it's very natural and difficult to prove, isn't it? So are you better off not disclosing?
But I think if you research a potential employer and you're looking at their policies and practice, you'll get a sense really about their approach to disabilities. The TUC, or one of the big unions, has just produced a document called the Reasonable Adjustment Passport, which we have here, and the suggestion of that is that that's something that you take from employment to employment, and it has an example policy for employers, and the hope is that many more large employers will take up that kind of attitude to supporting people in the workplace with disabilities that they have.
And it may also be as a result of you working there, they may change their policy. So it could be a really positive thing for the organisation as a whole. So that's, what we hope may happen.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay, so basically I think we're sort of short on time, so I'm going to whiz through this very quickly. So for effective advocacy is to act early. So if you've got a problem, talk to someone, talk to us or talk to your union rep, or if you've got a mental health first aider, sort of do that. Absolutely essential. In the case study, that's what the gentleman did. He contacted us at the very beginning and we was able to advise him from the outset. The second thing is the Advocacy Alliance. If you look at the icons, advocacy is definitely a two-way street, and it really is this, you talk, I listen, and together we act. And with advocacy, you can get some sort of very good results. Advocacy works well when you build a very good relationship. Planning and agreeing actions. With an advocate, what we was able to do for this gentleman, because he wasn't unemployed, but he was off sick, and he wanted to return to work. So his employer was aware of the Equality Act, but it needed us at OCD Action to really elucidate what their obligations to him under the Equality Act were. Anyway, as a result of that, we was able to help him sort of develop a set of reasonable adjustments. We sort of developed a phased return to work plan, and we also attended a meeting with his line manager. And in that meeting, we was able to agree with the employer his reasonable adjustments, his phased return, and they also offered him a new post to make, which was going to be less stressful. So that was something that we worked on together, and we did get a good outcome on that. Keeping your advocate informed and updated. What I'm going to say is that advocacy cases are won or lost on this point. If you do sort of decide to seek advocacy help, very important to keep people aware. We've had a number of cases where when we were informed very early on from the outset, we was able to take or help the person take very effective action. We've also had cases where we were told sort of too late, and when that happened, we weren't able to, help the person in the way that we would like. Sort of committing to advocacy. Well, advocacy, it's not normally a quick fix, so it can be like a bit of a long haul. So the gentleman that I was talking about, we helped him go from being off work for a period of 7 or 8 months, and we got him back into full-time employment with reasonable adjustments. But the whole process took, as I said, probably about 10 months. So it's not a quick fix. So you've got to be prepared and committed to see it through. Developing a proactive approach. I mean, as advocates, we work as professional advocates, but our ultimate goal is always for people to self-advocate. That's why we've got a self-advocacy toolkit, which there's a copy for you to take home today. In this, part of the advocacy service with this gentleman, as things progressed and he became more confident, he was able to actually proactively self-advocate. And one of the things that he did, and it's something that I learned, is that he went and negotiated with his human resource department this reasonable adjustments passport. And that it's a living document, which means that if ever there's a new manager or he's moved to another position in the organisation, he won't have to renegotiate his reasonable adjustments, and he won't have to re-explain them. So I thought that was very proactive of him, and that was a great example of self-advocacy, And another thing, just to end, getting what you want is not necessarily what you get or liking what you get. In the case study, the guy got back to work, he got offered a job in a less stressful department that he was very happy with, but the bit that he didn't want is that there was a pay adjustment. So this is another reality, that even though we can get adjustments, there may be some compromise. So it's what we call the blind side of advocacy, that we're not always aware that there may be other factors, that once we get what we want, it brings in other stuff we don't want.
Okay. So, what do we do when we get stuck? So, even as trained advocates, we get stuck with cases all the time. So the one thing that we do always say is be persistent, don't give up. Keep going, keep calling, keep ringing, keep making phone calls, keep doing all of those things. And don't lose focus. Because I fully understand kind of when you're in a situation where you're highly anxious, you're dealing with a lot of different things, it's really easy to get disheartened and to say kind of what's the point of this, I'm not going to win this case, what is the point? And I think the thing is just keep going. Please keep going with it. We always say try again and then try some more. And it may be because you've been so persistent that they finally say, well, okay, they're not giving up, so we're now going to have to do something. So keep going and don't be afraid to escalate things further. So what we do always say is it may be the case where you're having an issue with perhaps your line manager, but maybe your line manager has a manager, or the department has a manager, or you may need to go to a regional manager. Please keep escalating things up. Don't just think, this is the person that's in front of me, this is the person I have to deal with. Please keep going. So, how can I use the self-advocacy toolkit? So, in the information that we've given you, if you have a look through, you'll notice that in our toolkits, there aren't any page numbers. So what we want you to do is please use our toolkit, please rip bits out. You can use it to go to interviews, assessments, meetings, appointments. So there's information there about making phone calls, there's information in there about going to meetings. So you can take whatever bit you want out and literally put all of the information that you need in there, and you can take that to an appointment or in a meeting with you. And you can literally say, this is what I want, this is what I need from you. So please feel free to do that. So we also have information about gathering what you need. So please do your research. You can come to us, there's many places that you can go, but get all the information that you need to make your point. Identify your goal. Again, know what you want. Use all of these things to get what you want. Get some support. We're here, there are other organisations out there, family, friends, people who have maybe been through the same thing. Please don't think that you're on your own. I get that it's kind of really, really scary when you're dealing with an issue like this, but just maybe talking to someone else might be really helpful for you. So just to say to someone, this is what I'm going through, what do you think? And it may be something that they say to you that might make a huge difference. So make a plan. So know what you want, know where you're going, know what you want to happen. So keep a record of everything. One of the things that we do always say is please, please, please get everything in writing. If you can get everything documented, then absolutely brilliant, because it's far harder to contest things that are written than things that are done over the phone. So unless you're recording every phone call that you make, which probably most people aren't going to do, it's very easy for that person to say, he said, she said, that didn't happen. If you have everything documented in writing and you have a record of everything, then they can't contest that information. So use the reasonable adjustments passport. So we have this information here. Please feel free to take that with you. And there's also information on the TUC website. There's Remploy websites. There's various other websites that you can go to that you can get this information. But information is out there. So please don't be afraid to look for that. And last but not least, again, be persistent. Don't give up. Just keep going. And that's what we always say. Just keep trying. So there are lots of sources of support out there. So we do have this as well in the information, so you don't need to kind of rush to take photos or anything. So yeah, we do have this. But these are just some really valuable organisations and websites that you can get information about employment. So there's the EASS, there's ACAS, there's a Disability Law Service. If you think kind of your issue is becoming a legal issue and you need more support, then please feel free to use all of these organisations. Mind have a brilliant website, a fantastic info line, and obviously there's OCD Action. So if you get to a stage where you're worried about things, please have a chat with us. Please come to us in the early stages, and we'll see what we can do to help you.
Unfortunately, we run out of time to answer any questions. But this is how you might access the service.
So please feel free to give us a call, send us emails, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you didn't get a chance to ask today.
Thanks very
Okay,
much.
thanks
so
for being here
much.
today.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.